Welcome back, all you lovely people. I hope you had a nice little break there, and hey, we're ready to dive in to more Kant. Can't you handle it? Oh, I think I did that pun already. Oh, well, anyway. Now, as I said in the previous video, Kant wants to move away or move beyond, or however you want to think of it, from that mere formal understanding. Again, the moral law, yes, it's something universal. And when you're acting, then your action should be according to a maxim that itself could be universal, thus showing that you're respecting the moral law. But instead, Kant wants to, again, to tell us, what does the moral law actually mean? What is it trying to tell us? Not just to be universal, the law itself is not just universal. It's actually should be having some substance to it. There should be something going on there. And as I've already kind of indicated, it's going to be about respect, about why and how we ought to respect each other. And Kant is ultimately going to ground that respect on something about our nature as human beings. And Kant really does think humans are pretty interesting. And a lot of his discussion, we're going to see ideas we've seen before, and he's going to take into all sorts of crazy new places. It's awesome. Because on the one hand, of course, as we've seen in this class already, is that we are animals. Yes, we are. And as animals, we have sentience. We've seen this a lot. And our sentience, according to Kant now we're getting a little interesting. According to Kant, it's our sentience. Is what that gives us our inclinations, our desires, our appetites, right? The things we need to satisfy or feed. These come from our sentience because all animals have this. Yeah, of course, all animals have inclinations, desires, and appetites. And those inclinations, desires, and appetites, that creates the incentives for our actions. And for animals as well, right? Why did they do it? Oh, they did it to feed or, avoid to survive, right? That's basic, what it means to have sentience as we engage in those kinds of activities. And yeah. And so, and Kant says, yeah, that's where these incentives come from. Because look, you're watching this video right now. And what's the incentive you have for watching this video right now? Well, I assume it's to learn about Kant. Maybe. No? You're like, oh, God. Well, maybe it's to get a good grade. Okay, that makes sense. That's a nice incentive. Or as we saw maybe in the last module, maybe you're just obeying your kidnappers because they're forcing you to watch this. And I'm sorry, why are they doing this to you? They're making you do another module? Ugh, weird kidnappers. But yeah, these incentives are just based on your particular, I don't know what yours are. I've just given a few examples. You, the viewer, I don't know what your particular desires and inclinations are to watch this video. Your incentive. Is it to learn about Kant? Is it to get a good grade? Is it to appease your kidnappers? It could be any of that. But again, Kant says all animals operate that way. That is, all animals act on incentives to satisfy their particular inclinations, desires, and appetites. And Kant says, when Kant looks at this, he says, all this is pretty subjective. Now, by subjective, Kant means something very specific by subjective. So I'll explain it and then we'll start connecting it up. Because by subjective, Kant means that something is subjective when it appeals to or applies to this person or that person. However, it might not apply to all persons. So whenever Kant uses the word subjective, that's just what he's meaning. He's meaning this is a reason, or this is an idea, or this is something that applies to one or two people perhaps, but it doesn't necessarily apply to everyone. And we saw that with your incentive for watching this video. You have an incentive to watching this right now. Good grade, learn about Kant, you're bored, kidnappers, whatever. But of course, you probably realize the reason you're doing it is probably not the reason that everyone is doing it, right? Some people aren't doing it, so they have no incentive. So, but again, sentience is just part of our human nature. Sentience is what sets up the ability for you to have your personal inclinations, desires, appetites we've talked about. And that animalistic part of your nature is pretty subjective because, it's based on your personal desires and appetites. And we all have different sorts of desires, inclinations, and appetites. My desire is to be a philosophy professor and get through this in one piece. Your desire is probably far different from that. Why you're here is far different from the reason why I'm here right now. Obviously, I'm recording, you're watching, and why you're watching is far different from what other people might be doing when they're watching this video, when your classmates are watching it, if they're watching it. But again, we're not merely animals. We've seen this also a lot in this class. We are also rational beings. We have sapience. We've talked about this idea a bit because it's sapience that gives us the ability to make our rational plans and lead our structured lives. And again, this is a phrase, this is kind of the phrase I've been using, but we've seen like this idea, they might use different language, but the same idea we've been seeing repeatedly We saw this in the utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill. We saw this in Bernard Williams when he's rejecting utilitarianism. Robert Nozick talks about constraints. He talks about leading structured lives, meaning the meaning of life, right? And then we saw this in Alex John London when he talks about what the shared ability we all have as a shared interest is to make plans and lead a structured life. And we see this now in Kant too. If you go to page 26, jump to page 26 in Kant, and let's scroll over there. We can see Kant is saying this too, where this is how he puts it. He says that everything in nature works according to laws. Only a rational being has the capacity to act according to the representation of laws, that is, according to principles or a will. And hey, let's just jump even further ahead, down to page 39. On page 39, we can see something similar. Let's just go there, where Immanuel Kant says, the will is thought as a capacity to determine itself to action in conformity with the representation of certain laws. And such a capacity can be found only in rational beings. There he's connecting it up. A lot of ideas there. I mean, and some of this ideas I've already introduced to you in the previous module, right? This idea, and there's some new stuff here too, I guess, and I think it's all cool, but we'll see. We'll get through it. Anyway, some of the old ideas that I've already told you about is about how Kant is talking about how the will is the foundation for our capacity to choose to do something, our capacity to act. Again, our capacity to choose, our capacity to act. And when we're choosing and acting, we're acting according to principles, right? Kant says, or he says we're acting according to the representation of laws. And yeah, that's all familiar. We've seen in the previous module, where Kant is saying then that these representation of laws, these principles for action, yeah, those are just the maxims. How we turn the representation of law to your action is your maxim. And we've seen that now already. So what's new? What's new here then is that Kant is saying, well, this is kind of cool, that everything in nature acts according to laws. I mean, physical things act according to, laws of gravity. He thinks that animals, regular non-human animals act according to laws of survival and reproduction. But rational beings like us, we're special. Rational beings like us, we can actually act according to representations of laws. Because, again, things like the pencil, non-human animals, they act according to laws. They're kind of stuck. They're stuck in that network of acting. Us, we can actually act according to representation of laws. And what Kant means by that is actually, it sounds fancy, it's relatively straightforward and not surprising. Kant is just saying that we act with intent. We have intent when we choose. We look at our choices, we can select what we're going to choose. And Kant says by, choosing to act, and, that's just deciding which law, which principle, which maxim we actually are going to act upon. Again, we're going to do something for the sake of something, right? We've seen that. That's what a maxim tells us. And so what Kant is saying is what reason gives us reason gives us the ability to look at these principles and derive our actions from them, because we can see what the different maxims are, what the different representations of law are. We can see all these. And then just choosing and acting, that's acting with intention. Intention just means you're doing something, you know what you're doing, and you know why you're doing it. So you're watching this video. You're watching this video right now based on considerations. You consider different reasons for and against watching this right now and not just clicking next. Thank you. But ultimately what you chose, I guess, which is to watch this now, yeah, that reflects your maxim. And your maxim is just the representation of the law you've chosen. Because animals can't pick the maxim, right? The pencil can't pick the maxim, drop. I don't know. Oh, you got a maxim there, buddy. And my cats don't have maxims, right? They don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it. They're just doing it. And so again, your maxim is maybe a law about what you need to do to get a good grade, or maybe a law about what you need to do to learn about Kant, or maybe a law about what you need to do to make your kidnappers happy, whatever. These are all different representations of laws. And some of these representations might be good. Some of them might be quite bad. But again, they're all representations of laws for you that you can use to understand what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. And so I like this idea because now we're kind of merging some new and old together but here's something also new, something very important, something very cool, I think, because the idea is that you have the ability to choose which maxim you act on, because there's many and you get to pick. You have the ability to choose which principle you act upon. You have the ability to choose what representation of law you act upon. And why can you choose those things? Well, you're rational, I suppose, but it's more than just being rational that helps you choose. It's the fact that you have a free will. Kant says humans are very unique in this way. We have the animal nature of, sentience and desire and inclination and appetite, but we also have the rational nature of sapience. We are very special. We have both sentience and sapience. Sapience letting us understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And so we can act with both desire and reason. That's pretty cool, according to Kant, because we can choose how we act. We can choose which desires to satisfy, and we can choose how we decide to satisfy them. Again, some of these, that's free will, and some of these ways will be good, some of these ways will be bad. But again, that's free will, the ability to choose which maxim, which principles, which representations of laws. You get to choose which ones you act upon. And now, of course, as we've seen, Kant is going to suggest that the good maxims, the good principles, the good representations of law, of course, we've seen the formal argument is that these are universalizable. They can be, all the good maxims can be represented as universal laws. And yeah, that's what a good maxim is. And that's kind of cool. Okay, fine. So the first thing is that we're back to the old the formula of universal law. We've seen that. That's the formal one. But now Kant wants to dig deeper, because he wants to introduce this idea of something being objective. Now, what does Kant mean by objective? Again, a very specialized sense here. Kant means is that by objective, he means something that appeals to or applies to every rational being as such. It does apply to all persons. So whenever you see Kant use the word objective, that's what he means. He means this is something that would apply to all rational beings. And he'll call a rational being is just a person, according to Kant. We'll see that a little bit later on in a future video. But Kant's idea here is just that when he's talking about subjective, it just applies to this person or that person, but not necessarily all persons. But when he's talking objective, this is something that does apply to all persons. And it applies to all persons because they are rational. And again, this distinction between subjective and objective is crucial for Kant, because Kant believes that most philosophers, most people who did ethics, stay in the subjective. They build a system of morality about satisfying inclination, desire, and appetite. Or they build morality around happiness and pleasure. We've seen all of these views, right? Because notice, these are all teleological approaches. We've seen all these teleological processes. It's about satisfying desire and inclination, or it's about being happy, or it's about experiencing pleasure. And Kant, of course, doesn't like these teleological, obviously he's not a teleologist, because he says, again, we've seen that these teleological approaches just care about outcomes and other conditional goods. That is, goods that could be evil in the wrong hands, and these goods are conditional on the goodwill. We've seen that before. But again, now Kant's digging deeper. I like this. We can get to rehearse old ideas and then see how Kant goes beyond these formal considerations into really something meaty and interesting. Because why he hates these teleological approaches, now we can say, is that he thinks they're hopelessly subjective. They're subjective because they're built around desire, inclination, pleasure, and happiness. He thinks all these things are subjective. And this is something you guys, I think, have thought about, because I see it in the tweets for sure, is that, we have different desires and inclinations. You have your desires and inclinations. Those are different from my desires and inclinations. So those are subjective because they're different. What makes you happy and gives you pleasure, probably pretty different from what makes me happy and what gives me pleasure. Again, that's all subjective then. And that's what Kant means by being subjective, is that persons have different desires, inclinations, pleasures, and happiness. And so Kant says, well, that's a very subjective morality, and could be used for things that we might think are quite evil. And we've seen that, I think, with utilitarianism, egoism. These shouldn't be shocking. And Kant's saying the same thing. And he's saying the problem is that they're subjective. But then what does an objective morality look like? Okay, we got the subjective one, but what would it mean to build a morality on something that applies to all persons because all persons are rational beings? And this is where things are going to be headed. Kant wants to specify an objective morality. and we'll get there in a moment, but I want to put a few things together here with a couple images or slides, I guess, just so you can see what Kant is doing here. Because this is going to be an interpretation of a couple nightmare paragraphs of Kant. Because we have this, if you go to turn 27, scroll all the way up on 27. Oh yeah, that paragraph there, that's a freaking nightmare. And let's jump to the next page, page 28 there. And again, scroll all the way up, page 28. Yeah, look at that. Oh gosh. So yeah, those two paragraphs are nightmares. But I've actually kind of summarized them already, and I'm just going to put a little twist on it and we'll be good. Because as I've said, Kant sees us as humans as a weird hybrid of two different psychologies. On the one hand, we have the psychology of the purely sensual. This is the psychology of animals. This is the psychology of creatures that have no free will, because they're just slaves to their inclination, desires, and appetites. There's no reason here. All they do is determine solely on, again, these inclinations, these desires, and these appetites. The only thing driving the purely sensual being is subjective incentives to act. Because again, these are subjective incentives based on desire, inclination, appetite, which are probably just built from instinct and not reason at all. And again, some people can be like this. And it's not just animals, right? Sometimes like people in very bad situations who are just struggling to survive and get through, if you're in extreme poverty or an extremely dangerous situation, you can kind of have that animal nature take over, and you're just instinct kicks in and you're trying to survive and just make it, you're in survival mode. You probably may not act very rationally if it's really a bad situation, but hopefully we're not in that right now. I hope not. But Kant says, but look, that animal part is the purely sensual part. That's not the only part. We have, again, the psychology of the purely rational. And Kant, gives this language of this being a divine will or the holy will. And what he's kind of getting at here is if there's a God and if there are like angels or whatever, these holy creatures, we don't have to assume they exist, but if they exist, then this is the type of will that they would have. That's where reason alone decides how they will act. And now what's very interesting here, this is really cool and very controversial. People, I don't know what you think about this, but Kant is going to say that the holy will of God and the angels, if they exist, they aren't free either, because they are now slaves to pure reason, because they can't choose either. The animals can't choose. They're always going to act according to desire and instinct. And God and the angels, if they exist, they can't choose either, because they're always going to do what reason says to do. There's no choice. And if there's no choice, there's no free will. And so, Kant is saying that angels and God, beings with a holy will, beings with a divine will, do not have free will. But in any case, when looking at this divine will, the only thing driving it here then is objective motivation, because these motivations, again, they're objective. So that means they have to apply to all persons, all rational beings. And so now we can see that, and you guys might know this from life, our will is a mess. Because we're not merely animals, nor are we these divine beings of perfect reason. We have elements of both. And we're a mess. But this mess is precisely what allows us to make choices. And if we can make choices, we have a free will, according to Kant. So we're a mess because we have desire, inclination, and appetite. And those are pulling both me in all different directions. And then you have a bunch of different desires, inclinations, appetites. They're pulling you. And then we're different. And then it's just a mess, right? And so how the hell are we all going to live together? But good news. We all have something in common. This should sound familiar, because we all share reason. And reason can help us examine all this stuff. And reason can help us figure out how we should act. We can decide which desires we should act on, and we can decide how to act on them. We're not slaves like the animals are. And we have that element of divine reason in us that allows us to, at least gives us hope. And so when we combine this, we get the fallible will, the human will, the free will, the fallible will, because we can make mistakes. We can ignore reason and act on inclination or desire. And Kant calls this human will, and I love this phrase. I love this phrase to death. It's on page 27 if you're curious, but he calls this a will not altogether good. That's the fallible will. It's trying to be good sometimes, but it's not always going to succeed. And so yes, we have this fallible will. And this fallible will is when reason all by itself does not sufficiently determine the will or what principles to follow and what laws to obey. And this is because we're a fallible human will. We can try to be rational. We have that gift, but subjective incentives, desire, inclination, appetites can get in the way and distract us from what we should be doing, objectively speaking. So our animal instinct pulls us away from our rational instinct, and vice versa. It can be tough. And so again, the idea is that my personal feelings, my desires, the stuff I want, they can lead me to go after, those particular things that I want. And some of those things might not be something that rational people could will or want. I mean, like when I tell a lie, and we've already seen that there's a practical contradiction in telling a lie where, the action and the purpose don't work if you make it universal. And Kant will say in this context, yeah, lying is not objective. Lying is not something that all rational beings would accept or want for obvious reasons, because that leads to all sorts of problems. And so, yeah, we're this mix of weird, subjective, and rational. And this comes together in Kant's idea, this weird word he uses, necessitation. Necessitation. What Kant means by that is that we're not perfectly rational. We are, incompletely rational. We have it at least. And necessitation is just about how we, the imperfect beings, can still obey the laws of reason, even though we might not want to, we might not desire to do it. I might want to tell that lie, but my reason's like, dude, rational beings can't all agree on that, obviously, because you're going to use it to manipulate them. But again, so we have this nature of a free will. Our desires, inclinations, appetites pull us in all these different directions, but we can choose, because of reason, how to respond to those things. Again, God can't do that because God doesn't have desires, inclinations, and appetites, right? God is not a sensual, subjective being. If he is or she is, that's interesting. But so do we choose like an animal and give in to our subjective desires, or do we choose to act like a rational being and conform to the objective demands of morality, whatever those might be? And again, we're just talking about objective, applies to all rational beings. But that sounds cool. Okay, so we get to choose all that. That's our free will. But Kant notices immediately we have a problem. That is, if we have a free will, how can morality command us? How can there be a morality I'm supposed to obey? If I'm supposed to be free, it sounds like commands and obedience. That doesn't sound like a free will. That sounds like, again, just a new slave. I'm a slave to something here. Because again, if Kant is saying that you and I, we must obey whatever the subjective morality is, how are we free? Aren't we just slaves to the moral law? Yeah, good question, Kant. Before we go into Kant's answer, how he develops his answer to that, let's take a stretch, rest our eyes. There we go, I felt good. And we can come back and see how it's possible for a being with a free will to obey commands. It's going to be curious. See you back here in a moment.